Alrighty, y'all. It's time to talk about Epstein once again. So Howard Lutnick answered some questions in a closed-door session on Capitol Hill this week, and none were too impressed. But that's just an update, and it won't be the main focus of the segment. We're going to go ahead and talk about that suicide note that prosecutors in the case of Nick Tartaglione made public recently. So most of the updates on the Epstein suicide note were a result of an interview given on a podcast by Nick Tartaglione about its existence last week. If you want to learn more about Nick Tartaglione, I highly recommend that you guys really watch the last episode that we posted on this channel. Episode number 20 is Epstein Still Alive? But Nick Tartaglione was basically Epstein's cellmate leading up to his actual suicide, but he was removed as a cellmate just days prior. So on a podcast, Tartaglione talks about the existence of the suicide note from Epstein. And the reason that it hasn't been made public is because it's actually evidence in a case that's currently, being prosecuted regarding Nick Tartaglione. But with Tartaglione's public comments and a public interest in seeing the Epstein suicide note, the suicide note was actually released on Wednesday to the public in full. So what's in the note? It's not a particularly long one, so I'll just read the contents right now. They investigated me for months, found nothing. So 15-year-old charges resulted. It is a treat to be able to choose what time to say goodbye. What you want me to do? Bust out crying? No fun, underlined, not worth it. So not a whole lot of content there. To give you context, Jeffrey Epstein basically attempted suicide 3 weeks before his successful suicide attempt on August 10th, 2019. Originally, when guards went into Epstein's cell and he had abrasions on his neck and it looks like he tried to hang himself, he blamed it on Nick Tartaglione, but eventually that blame became rescinded days later. So we're left with three possible explanations. Epstein had a failed suicide attempt weeks before his successful one. Nick Tartaglione tried to kill him and lied, or someone else attacked him entirely. One thing to note is that Mr. Tartaglione's story continually checks out, especially with the case of the suicide note, since he talked about it on his podcast and then it physically manifested. And also there's the fact that Tartaglione, yes, he was present for the first suicide attempt, but Tartaglione was no longer his cellmate when Epstein did commit suicide. The line, "What you want me to do? Bust out crying," is a phrase that Epstein uses a couple more times in the Epstein files when talking about other situations. But it's actually a line from a 1931 Little Rascals film, Little Daddy, where the character Stymie says, "Well, what do you want me to do? Bust out crying?" So overall, it's a pretty chill tone for a man about to engage in his first suicide attempt. And it's a man that's also still with a quite inflated ego and is defiant till the end. I don't really believe that this note is a forgery, but if I am going to go down the most conspiratorial rabbit hole for me possible, I can't acknowledge that it's possible that Tartaglione might be working with the government as part of some psychological operation, to throw us off the scent or the trail of Epstein. But let's also consider this. Jeffrey Epstein was actually showing a willingness to cooperate with the state between his first suicide attempt and his death. In late July 2019, Epstein talked to his defense team about cooperating with the government and, quote unquote, ratting on other individuals. And this was less than 2 weeks before he ends up dead. If Nick Tartaglione or another outside force was responsible for attacking Jeffrey Epstein those 3 weeks before he actually died, they were either wildly unsuccessful in their attempt at killing Jeffrey Epstein, or it was to scare him, and it must have been to scare him about cooperation. Yet Jeffrey Epstein cooperated anyways, and he ends up dead. And of course, the idea that Nick Tartaglione or another person at the jail was responsible for the abrasions to the neck and all that, it doesn't seem to line up with the idea of a suicide note, and a suicide note that was drafted in such a timely manner to the event. Why would you try to kill yourself and then try to cooperate with the government, and while that's going on, actually successfully kill yourself? So here's the theory that I wanted to talk about. I'm not saying that it's perhaps like the most compelling theory, but I couldn't help but think about it while I was researching this topic. And it's starting to make a lot of things make more and more sense. Again, this is just a possibility. But imagine there is some secret cabal that Jeffrey Epstein was a part of that mirrors the world in like the Eyes Wide Shut movie. And these people are committing atrocities behind closed doors, like sex trafficking children, etc. It would make perfect sense to me, at least, And I think it's well supported in the Epstein files with, for example, the way that Les Wexner responds to Epstein being caught in 2008 by basically, reprimanding him for getting caught, not doing the actions. That if you did personally get caught, depending on the circumstances, you would have to do whatever you could in your arsenal to kill yourself. I don't think this arrangement would be particularly shocking. So now I'm going to paint a picture for you. Suppose Jeffrey Epstein is right. Suppose, like he said in his suicide note, that the crimes he was being charged with were from 15 years ago, and that that's all they could find from investigations into him, and that this is why he's in jail. So why would you bring up the charges now? Well, who was president at the time? It was Trump's Department of Justice that brought charges forward through the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York in 2019. Epstein flew from his apartment in Paris to be detained in New York, and then an investigation in France was created shortly after. So the DOJ not only had to start creating cases on old information, but they were also giving information to other countries so that they could open investigations into Jeffrey Epstein as well. The Department of Justice deciding to bring the case forward puts Epstein in jail, awaiting trial for charges that are becoming more and more publicized. Therefore, Trump's Department of Justice initiated the conditions for Jeffrey Epstein to have to kill himself, referring back to our eyes wide shut hypothesis. And it was Trump's Department of Justice that referred Nick Tartaglione to be cellmates with Jeffrey Epstein in the first place. Go listen to the last episode. The placement of Nick Tartaglione was perhaps a signal to Jeffrey Epstein. At first, when we see it with the tone of the suicide note, Jeffrey Epstein basically knows that this is the end of the road for him. So, as a faithful member of this eyes wide shut cabal, Jeffrey Epstein attempts suicide and fails. He lies about Nick Tartaglione being the aggressor because he wants to avoid suicide watch. And it wouldn't be hard to conceive that because Tartaglione was in jail for murdering 4 people and because Tartaglione was so pro-Trump, that Epstein probably didn't want to piss Tartaglione off. And it's also a possibility that through a failed suicide attempt and asphyxiation, that Epstein was just purely disoriented when he made the first Tartaglione claim that he had attacked him. But as this little mini theory goes, what if Jeffrey Epstein essentially has a change of heart after surviving his first suicide attempt? And this leads him to link up with his defense team and talk about cooperating with the government. The administration catches wind of this and is already fed up with a person who probably should have already disposed of himself as a loose end. Jeffrey Epstein admits very blatantly to his defense team the day before he winds up dead that he's not suicidal, which would be out of line with following through on this eyes wide shut hypothesis. And boom, Jeffrey Epstein is dead in his cell the next day, along with the orange blob that's mentioned on FBI logs that have leaked since then. And here's a little quote from a KSAT article that talks about this. However, in an interview with jail staff a week later, Epstein said that he had never had any issues with Tartaglione, was not threatened by him, and didn't want to make up something that isn't there, records show. He said he was not suicidal. After 31 hours on suicide watch, Epstein was downgraded to psychiatric observation. He was without a cellmate when he was found dead at the jail on August 10th, 2019. Officials said they found a handwritten note in Epstein's cell at the time, but it didn't appear to be a suicide note so much as a list of grievances about the filthy conditions of the jail, which had since been closed. So is it also possible that this second suicide note truly was just a list of grievances and Epstein had no intentions of dying that night? Either way, you can always reach out to the show at info@jetfuelcan'tmeltsteelbeams.com and let me know what you guys think about this idea of Jeffrey Epstein leaving behind this suicide note. Do you guys think that Nick Tartaglione is a psychological operation? Maybe Nick Tartaglione, who is already quite an interesting character to begin with, is part of some government psychological operation in the first place. Either way, if you see Nick Tartaglione's presence in his cell as kind of a wink-wink from the forces to be, saying to Jeffrey Epstein, you better go through with this, with the cavalier attitude you see in the suicide note that came out, and with all this information leaking about the guards on duty that night making money and all of these interesting Google searches, the idea that Jeffrey Epstein was disposed of as a loose end after having an unsuccessful suicide attempt starts to make a lot of sense. And maybe make sense is about as close as we'll get to the truth on the Epstein matter, at least for this episode. And if they do start staging an alien invasion this week, then just stay safe out there, folks, and take everything with a grain of salt.